Hello, 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 hello. Welcome to our experimental live podcast in front of a studio audience from an undisclosed location somewhere in the vicinity of Wheaton, Illinois. So thank you all for joining. Apologies for starting late, but one of the delightful things about being part of an event is we can't control when our lunch catering ends up being a little late. So we decided to eat lunch first before this, lest we be too grumpy and have a very unpleasant conversation. So I'm pleased to be joined here today by two special guests. Actually, I'm their special guest. They have this event planned, and they just invited me to come do a podcast as part of it. Bethel McGrew and Paul Vanderklay. You may already know them online, but if not, Bethel is a mathematician, teacher, and writer. And Paul Vanderklay is a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church and also runs a great YouTube channel. And so I have put links to both of their materials in the show notes if you want to check that out. So thank you both for coming. And I just wanted to have you two each give me 2 minutes about yourself, a little more depth about yourself, and especially where you're coming from kind of a religious perspective. I know you're in the CRC, but just enough about your background so the people will know who you are before we dig into the questions. We'll start with you, Bethel.
Okay. So I like to call myself a high church Baptist, just to kind of throw everybody off right away. I see someone's giving me a thumbs up back there. So both of my parents have GARBC roots, so which is Northern Baptist essentially. But then they got into liturgy in their 20s. So they raised me in a small conservative Anglican church. So I'm deeply familiar with Anglican liturgy, the Book of Common Prayer, and that whole thing. But then I was also raised with kind of a Baptist soul. So I sort of fall between stools denominationally. I love the Baptist tradition. I love the Anglican tradition. I love preserving what's good in both of those things. So then as far as my background as kind of a writer / public figure, I wrote under a pen name for a number of years because I wasn't sure where my career was going. I thought maybe I was going to be an academic, be in the university, in which case it wouldn't be great to put political opinions out there under my own name. But then my life took a couple left turns, and I started thinking probably my platform was getting big enough that it was good to just go public and be myself. So I wrote under the name Esther O'Reilly for a while, and now I'm just out under my own name, Bethel McGrew. So yeah, I'm kind of a generalist. I wear a lot of different hats. I have a lot of different interests. So I'm a social critic, I would say, essayist. I dip my toe in lots of different worlds, and sometimes I cause trouble on Twitter. So that's a little bit about me.
My name is Paul Vanderklay. I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. My father was called to Paterson by a couple of other Christian Reformed churches in the area to transform what had been sort of a gospel station to African Americans who had moved up to Paterson during the Great Migration. And so my father began there in 1960, and all my growing up years, rather unusual for a Christian Reformed minister's son, all in one place in Paterson. The church was predominantly African American, but as is the case in the Christian Reformed Church, I went to CRC day school. So I sort of had one foot in the African American community and one foot in the Dutch Reformed community. After that, I went to Calvin College, and after Calvin College, Calvin Seminary, and was a missionary in the Dominican Republic for a number of years. And then after that, I took a call to Sacramento, California, which was a similar church in that church had, for a period, been sort of a racial reconciliation church. California, the racial groups are not just African Americans, but also Hispanics and a whole variety of Asian communities. And so I've been pastoring there for a number of years, and I always blogged, but relative obscurity compared to now. Jordan Peterson came on the scene, and I began reading comments and Reddits and postings on him about how people became interested in Christianity because of what Jordan Peterson was talking about. I knew that I could see that he wasn't doing anything behind him institutionally, and I was concerned that people would find his videos, have sort of a flash of enthusiasm, but without a community behind, they would sort of just revert to the mean. I was thinking sort of in terms of what Billy Graham did. Billy Graham, of course, would go into a community, have a big crusade, but Billy Graham would mobilize churches to be ready to receive the people that Billy Graham incentivized with respect to Christianity. Now, I didn't have the kind of platform that could sort of catch everything that Jordan Peterson put out, but I also figured that if I started making videos, the YouTube algorithm would probably help my cause, which it did. And so once that came into being, a lot of my focus was help the people who found Jordan Peterson, became interested in Christianity, find good conversation partners to continue to explore meaning, faith, and many of the other issues that Jordan Peterson would raise. And that gave birth to the meetups, which gave birth to Estuary, which is sort of my program of helping people find good community groups for discussion. And that's kind of brought us here.
Yeah, and sorry, I'll just add a little bit. That's how Paul and I connected with each other. And that's sort of how doors began opening for me as a writer, was that I started writing about Jordan Peterson, and then the dominoes kind of started falling. So Peterson really has just created a lot of positive ripple effects, and our partnership is one of those.
Yes. I do find it interesting that you two are doing this event together, because you're kind of very different people from very different backgrounds. I'd say, Paul, you're very moderate, and Bethel, I'd say you're more disputational, you're more in the fray. But interesting, though, that Jordan Peterson is the one that brought you together. I came across Jordan Peterson, I think, relatively early, when he was still mostly known as a YouTuber, giving lectures on Genesis and that. And I thought it was amazing that he would get 200,000 views on a 2-hour lecture about Genesis. But I was never hugely influenced by Peterson, but I think he was emblematic of something that was kind of going on in the culture. There was this kind of ferment of voices speaking to people who weren't finding what they were looking for elsewhere, particularly young men. I saw this in the manosphere. Now we see it, I think, paradigmatically through guys like Peterson, but also Joe Rogan speaks to that, Jocko Willink. There are a lot of these guys that have become essentially sages, or these kind of sorcerer's apprentice type people. They look up to them, they're guides to especially young men, but also to many women who don't feel like the institutions of society and the traditional authorities of society are really speaking to them. And one of those authorities that has not been doing so well has been the church and reaching them. And that's how I got interested in starting my writing on religious issues in The Masculinist. Originally was my newspaper letter was called, because I saw young men turning to all these online authority figures, and like the church is not reaching them. And so why has the church been so ineffective when hordes of people are tuning into other people and they're listening to 2-hour lectures on Genesis from Jordan Peterson, but they're not listening to 20 minutes from their pastor? So what's going on? And so I think this speaks to kind of that there's been a lot of cultural change and a lot of cultural dislocation and ferment and things going on. It's affected secular society, and it's also affecting the church. And so what I kind of wanted to talk about today is a little bit about some of the dynamics going on in the evangelical church world. And I think it's all three of us have commented, I think, on the evangelical world, even though we're at somewhat of a remove from it. The standard coding systems for church affiliation among Protestants has basically 3 categories: mainline, evangelical, and black Protestant. Those are your choices. And so evangelical is kind of a catch-all bucket. I'd say the CRC is sort of a quasi-mainline denomination in a sense. It's really maybe like the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. It's kind of its own self-contained universe, kind of ethnically oriented, geographically concentrated, but still, I would say, relatively, theologically traditional. There's a lot of variety in there. Then you're in this like Anglican Episcopal Church spinoff. I actually came from out of a background that was a rural Pentecostal kind of fundamentalist environment, which I think is still out of when I think of an evangelical church. I think of these big suburban, non-denominational megachurches, Saddleback, Willow Creek. There are numerous of them. There's several of them in Indianapolis with thousands and thousands of members in multiple sites. But it is interesting that to some extent, you would classify us in that schema as evangelical. We're not really in the evangelical core. And I think that helps give a little bit of attachment and a little bit of a perspective on the issue. Because what I see as the evangelical church has been in a state of kind of realignment, sort of turmoil, conflict. So we've seen what I used to say, there used to be essentially the culture war, where kind of, evangelicals would fight with secular society. Now the culture war has moved internal to evangelical. There are people fighting. And we see a lot of realignments. We see people like David French, who would have been considered a religious right warrior, now spends most of his time critiquing the right. We've seen people like Russell Moore, leaving his denomination and sort of, again, kind of attacking Christians, more than he would have, you would have put him on the religious right team, I think, in a lot of ways. So I'm interested in your takes on what is happening. And, I've promoted this model that I call the three worlds model, which has basically said that, for those of you who don't know it, from, say, I've now officially dated the start of the positive world to the Kennedy assassination. So from the Kennedy assassination to like 1994, Christianity was in decline from sort of that mid-century peak, but it was still basically viewed positively. Then from 94 to 2014, Christianity was still no longer viewed positively, but was not really viewed negatively either. It was what I called it was a neutral world. And, being Christian was just one of many lifestyle choices you could have in a pluralistic public square. And then from about 2014, we've entered what I call the negative world, where society's turned somewhat hostile to Christianity. Certainly kind of elite culture is sort of hostile to Christianity, and especially to its moral systems. Christianity is sort of viewed as a threat to the new public order. And what I basically did was say, kind of divided evangelicals into three different groups. What I called the culture war types, the seeker-sensitive types, and then the cultural engagement types. The first two I associate as mostly emerging from the positive world, although continuing. And the cultural engagers, which you can think of as urban church type people, especially kind of emerging in that neutral world, and again, continuing to this day. But as we moved out of the negative world, those groups are really changing. And they're morphing. They're not just staying the same as they were before. The culture war people are still fighting, but they seem to have forgotten all about ethics and morals and leaders, because they all supported Trump, something that would have been unthinkable 15 years previously. So people are changing. So I'm interested in, when you see what's going on in the church today, I would just love to, forget about my framework for a minute. I would love to hear what you all see, and how should we think about what's happened to this evangelical world and how it's intersecting with these changes in the culture. What is underlying some of this turmoil and conflict in your view?
You start.
Oh, great. Well, what you just said there is really interesting about this sense of resentment against conservative evangelicals for supporting Trump, and how that seems to have thrown moral standards out of the window, because the Clinton era sort of hovers behind the Trump era, right? So I saw a lot of generational bitterness from sort of the children of that generation who was very opposed to Clinton, was now like, hey, mom and dad, you taught us to care about morality in the office of the president. You taught us to care about morality in the public square. What's up with this? And now we're just sort of going by what you taught us and not voting for Trump, but you're telling us we have to vote for the lesser of two evils, and that kind of thing. So that the generational handoff was kind of botched there in kind of a big way. So that may seem like I'm starting off by punching right.
It's okay to punch right.
It's okay to punch right.
I don't have a no punching right rule here. I punch right all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess that I'm jabbing right there. Yeah. I do think that was a problem, and I did watch that. The problem then, it's interesting, because I was a young blogger at the time that Trump began running, and when I look at some old stuff that I wrote on the blog that nobody was really reading, it was basically just me ranting. Some of my stuff then sounds a little bit like David French now. And French was kind of my hero at that time, actually. I think if French really had launched a bid for president, I might have voted for him, because he was sort of like my ideal conservative. And I was very anti-alt-right. I saw that forming. I saw how he was getting harassed. So I was a very National Review conservative in that sense. But then French just kept going and going and going. and would not stop. After I had sort of like worked through my stages of frustration over Trump and then kind of put it behind me, it's like French never got over it in some sense. And now he's like a broken record, and he's just sort of stuck in this rut. And we could get into the whole blessings of liberty thing, maybe a little the French Amari debate or whatnot. But I mean, we are in a new phase of culture war, I think. And so now you see the church is riven by that internally. You said a minute ago, you said Russell Moore might have been considered part of the religious right. I think Moore would be really offended by that, because I think he always hated the religious right. I can remember going back, he would dunk on the religious right and see himself very much opposed to that. I think of him as sort of a pro-life Democrat in some ways.
Well, I think he worked for like a Democratic congressman to start.
Didn't he name his son after that guy?
Maybe, yeah.
Unless I misremember. So, yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff we could get into there. But yeah, I should let Paul say some stuff now.
This is such a big topic. I think you can't understand any of this without going all the way back to the Civil War, understanding that Christian nationalism for the United States was the default position all the way through, in many respects, to the beginning of your positive world. In my videos early on, when I started looking at the Jordan Peterson stuff, there was, prior to, let's say, Darwin and the late 19th century, a big consensus with respect to, let's say, history, which would be sort of lower register in my language, and then morality and ethics, which would be upper register. Part of what happens in the main line is the default story about history and Christianity sort of gets taken apart, but ethics gets carried on, and that gets carried on through the Cold War, and so there continues to be alignment. And I think when you start with the transformation from positive to neutral to negative, see increasingly the rise of the new atheists in the, especially following 9/11. And the question as to whether or not, okay, the Christian story has been debunked, which of course the fundamentalists always resisted, and the evangelicals tried to nuance between, the neo-evangelicals with Billy Graham, Christianity Today, Carl F. Henry. They tried to, in some ways, nuance between the main line and the fundamentalists. And then when 9/11 comes along and you have Sam Harris, you have a whole group coming along and saying, the Christian moral system is bankrupt. They say that, but as many have pointed out before, they're also still leveraging many of the value assumptions of Christianity in their critique of the church.
Well, that's what Tom Holland always makes that point.
Right.
The guy who wrote Dominion. It's like,
right.
Even to critique Christianity, you have to do it within a Christian framework.
Right, right. With respect to evangelicalism, I often tell people it's not an ecclesia. Evangelicalism is not like the Roman Catholic Church where you have a definite structure with people in positions.
Right.
It's much more of a marketplace. And I actually recorded and posted a video this morning on a video that you made a while ago on evangelical elites. Evangelicals sort of find their elites and create their elites, and there's competing institutions. And the evangelical elites always have a very interesting relationship with these, I basically call them emergent spirits, that are rising and falling in the cultural conversation. And I think Russell Moore very much, you talked about Russell Moore and you talked about Kevin DeYoung. And I thought your analysis of both of them was spot on. Because part of what we see, how Trump changed the game was Trump in some ways exposed the reality that many of the Democratic elites would purport to speak on behalf of the lower class, poor and downtrodden, but many of those people looked at Trump and said, he's our guy because he doesn't look down on us. At least Trump doesn't hate doesn't hate his supporters. Whereas, and I think part of what we saw with Trump and Russell Moore and a lot of the never Trumpers was that many people began to say that Russell Moore isn't with us. And with every leader, there's always a subtle nuance of both representing the people, and when you speak for the people, they might not be able to articulate it, and that's very much what happened with Jordan Peterson. People heard him and said, yeah, if I could have said it, that's how I would have said it. And so then they push him up the hierarchy, and he's our leader. But leaders are always also sort of working that chaos order thing, and at the same time turning back and sort of gently critiquing and keeping their own movement fresh to allow it to continue. And your audience will tolerate that if they know you are with them.
Right.
And they know you are with them, that when, for the most part, you speak to the other rival groups and emergent spiritual communities out there, and if you represent them well, then they'll take a little bit of critique. But if they catch if they begin to believe that you think you're better than they are,
Yep.
they will turn on you in a minute. And so if you look at someone like Russell Moore, I think a lot of that happened, whereas Kevin DeYoung, I think, sort of worked that leadership dance, and people felt he is speaking for us, and because he is speaking for us well, we will also listen to his critiques because he has our best interest in mind. And when leaders lose that combination, they're toast.
Well, I think you're right about that, and there literally was a cleavage in the relationship between the leaders and the led. And this goes back, maybe think of Daniel Bell's Coming of Post-Industrial Society. I think a lot of it has to do with the decline of the industrial era, coming of post-industrialism. It really accelerated in the 80s. And Robert Reich wrote a great New York Times op-ed in 1992, I believe it was, called The Secession of the Successful, which basically said that, I think he was using the term back then, symbolic analysts, the upper middle class knowledge workers, are seceding from society. They're living in communities amongst themselves. They're developing their own set of values apart from the culture, essentially like a separate parallel aristocratic culture. And they increasingly no longer want to finance the services that the rest of the country relies on. And in essence, there's been the break between this kind of top 20% and bottom 80% of the country. And you can debate whether it's 80-20. It's not just the 1% and the 99%, there's another group. And that has only continued to grow. You know, Christopher Lasch, The Revolt of the Elites. There was a lot of this. In the early 90s, populism is absolute carbon copy clone of what we've seen in the last few years. Go back and read Arthur Schlesinger's Disuniting of America. It's exactly about people complaining about CRTs in the schools, only he was talking about Afrocentric curriculums. Mm-hmm. You remember that? And Kevin Phillips wrote some books, The Politics of Rich and Poor, Boiling Point, Ripping the Reagan Administration. And I do think there's been this sort of sense in which the people who have been elevated as leaders came to identify with this class of their peers, much more so than with the led. And people figure that out. People sense it, and you definitely see it. You see it in Democratic circles too. You see it in Republican politics. You see it in the evangelical church, and I think you see it less in ethnic minority communities because, for example, black elites, even if they move to an upscale suburb, even if they're not in a traditional ghetto or something, they realize, hey, if you got black skin, we're all in this together. We're not getting out of, there's no pretending like what happens to all of us are together. So there is more solidarity among ethnic minorities, but when you're part of these majority white groups, it's very easy for the elite to simply say that we'll just look down on them. In fact, we'll actually be more popular the more we look down on our followers. And so I think there is a unique dynamic among kind of white elites there. And it doesn't just affect the church, but it affects other parts of the country. Now, I can't help but notice this has happened at the same time we've really seen declines in trust of institutions and candidly decline in institutional functioning. And the elites that we have aren't leading very well, in my opinion. I think that's kind of, people don't seem to feel that way. It's like we had this kind of magic moment in the mid-century era. Then we kind of went into the 60s and Watergate and all that was bad. Then we kind of like pulled out of it, but now we're going into another tailspin. Just maybe pivoting away from the church and just thinking about it from a kind of an elite's perspective. If you are in this elite group, what do you think elites should do to repair this breach and start building institutional trust or functioning well again? Or do you just mean, I don't want to assume that those things are true. Maybe they should abandon them. What do you think needs to change from an elite perspective in light of what you just so aptly laid out?
Well, one revolutionary thing that we haven't mentioned is the rise of the internet, of course. So, I can remember the rise of pajamas media. There was literally a site called PJ Media. So, that ties into the breakdown of journalism as an institution. Nobody reads the newspaper anymore. Nobody trusts mainstream political commentators anymore because they feel like they can get the news through alternative channels. So, one thing that happens is elites will be like, well, we got to suppress misinformation, right? We got to make sure that they're not getting their info from the wrong places, which of course just has the exact opposite effect. They're just going to go to those places even more. I think you really saw that with the pandemic. So much mistrust there. So honesty is imperative from the journalism class, from the government class, from healthcare elites, because so many of the things that COVID contrarians were saying wound up being true. And so then you just go, well, what else are they lying about? Maybe they're lying about everything. And maybe you could even go into conspiracism and go, okay, well, now you actually have crossed a line to something that's not really true. But all of that could have been avoided if there had just been transparency from the beginning. Like, hey, you know what? We screwed up. We kind of screwed up with the vaccines. We kind of screwed up with, it turns out the masks thing didn't work. Our bad. Sorry about that. But you're never going to get an apology like that. You're never going to get the people to take the L. So a willingness to take the L would be really, really helpful there. And that can apply to many things within the church, but also outside the church.
I think the loss of institutional integrity is key to the inability of elites to connect with people. Part of this is, of course, that we have completely new, they're not really, we have all these new communities around us. We have these identitarian communities. To what degree are they communities? And now we have these rapid waves that move through the culture, usually via social media. I have a YouTube following sufficient to gather, a couple of dozen people here in a room in Chicago. I didn't have that 5 years ago. I was the same person. Why now? Well, YouTube, Twitter, Discord. It's clear that the internet has disrupted institutions in that it used to be that for the Christian Reformed Church, the Banner, which was its weekly periodical, and it was weekly, the editor of the Banner was probably the most important elite position in the denomination, perhaps only rivaled by the seminary president. All of that has been disrupted. And I think we're at a position now really quite know how to once again create these communities and the spirits that drive them in a way that's going to be stable over more than just a few years. And many of the things we need to build, you look at a building like this. It's not a particularly enormous building, but it takes time, capital, money, organization in order to achieve things. And those achievements come at usually because of institutions. And I think, Aaron, one of the things that you've been particularly good at is realizing those underpinnings and how important they are for the maintenance of the levels of societies that we have. And so at this very low level, the inabilities of communities to establish and maintain elites for, let's say, decades is, I think, giving people a sense that the future is at risk because we don't know how durable our elites or the institutions will be. And for evangelicals, for whom institution building has never been their strong point, I think it's a particular crisis.
Yeah, for evangelicals, the institutions that I see that have been created, they were kind of created for a particular personality or for a particular moment. And when that moment passes, well, the institutions endure. The mainline denominations, for all of their faults, lasted a long time, and many mainline churches have been around 200 years. And the loss of institutions like that is profound. And this idea that, well, yes, I'll just start a new church, and now it's a mega church. It's a mega church that's probably not going to survive all that long. And you already see a lot of these mega churches are already aging crowds. They're not the hot new thing anymore. And so you end up with these kind of institutions that don't necessarily last. So we are in a kind of a catabolic era, where we're kind of disintegrating. And historically, when those things have happened, we've come along and found a way to kind of do a reset. So essentially, nothing unique to this analysis for me is, we did a reset when we created the country and the Constitution, through the revolution of the Constitution. We had a disintegrating period, and then we did a reset after the Civil War. Then we had serious problems in the Great Depression. We did the New Deal on through the World War II kind of institutions that came out of that in the Cold War. And now, even with the 70s, things were looking not so good, and we said, look, we have to have reform. So even during the Carter administration, we have to deregulate. We had to make some changes. We had to fix some things. Militaries and kind of we did a lot of reforms in the late 70s into the 80s. Like the reforms that sort of put New York City on financial footing. Yeah. I sense that we need to have the ability to do something of an institutional reset. I don't think that the institution set and configuration that we have is something that has to last forever. Who knows what constitution we're under? We like to make fun of, for instance, on their Fifth Republic now or whatever. We're probably on our fifth constitution, really, in terms of how it really functions. And so we probably need to make some fundamental transitions, and whether we can do it, it's not clear, particularly because that old kind of, they talk about Christian nationalists, the mainliners were the Christian nationalists. If you want to understand Christian nationalism in its purest form, it's the Protestant establishment mainline church. And they really had a sense of ownership over the country. Maybe they felt like it was theirs, regardless of what everybody else thought. But they also had a sense of kind of stewardship over it. And I don't know that any of the current, I don't know if our current elites do. But I think we need to have some sort of an institutional kind of reset. And my view is it's rough. It's terrible to be a pastor today. It's from all I gather. I don't know what you're experiencing, but so much division. But just if you have an institution kind of optimizing for trust and institutional credibility seems to be like a very important to do.
Yeah, well, the issue here is that there is no one singular evangelical institution, right? Kind of in the nature of the beast, right? Because what is evangelicalism? Well, there's a bunch of little evangelicalisms, and you were sort of touching on how a lot of times you'll get something that springs up around a particular personality. So you have Mars Hill springing up around Mark Driscoll, or you have the personality of Ravi Zacharias. Okay, so that was sort of a boomer apologetics phenomenon, right? And so then if the personality goes down in flames, then the whole mini solar system around that personality goes down in flames. So I mean, like, the whole Ravi Zacharias complex shut down. And I know of a lot of guys who just lost their jobs and are never going to recover in the wake of all of that. So you just have like these series of big bangs and big crunches and big bangs and big crunches because there's no singular unifying evangelicalism. So like cult of personality, and of course we saw that with Bill Hybels and Willow Creek, and it really cuts across the conservative liberal divide, so to speak, right? So it doesn't matter, Robbie was big in conservative circles, Hybels was big in more seeker-sensitive circles. So I was just going to add that thought.
I'm curious what you think about the flight from the evangelical label. That it seems to be lots of people today like to muddy the waters about evangelicalism. It's what is evangelicalism? There's this white evangelicalism, all these evangelicalism, and all these things now. People, they're kind of disclaiming the label. I don't consider myself that, and so I noticed this kind of when Keller was in his heyday. I would see people that would say I'm a Presbyterian. And it's sort of like if you call yourself a Presbyterian, then people, they don't really know what you are. You can kind of, maybe it's kind of like these aren't the droids you're looking for, kind of thing, where, maybe they think you're in the main line rather than you're in this conservative. And now I notice that like Anglican is really the flavor of the month. Tons of I'm an Anglican. Yeah. So it seems like there's kind of this quest for labels to escape the evangelical label. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's also where you get a lot of people converting to Catholicism or converting to Orthodoxy because they want to feel like they're a part of something, like an umbrella thing that's bigger than them. So yeah, go ahead.
I think it's helpful to remember that evangelicalism comes fairly late, really the mid-20th century, but it grows out of if you read Mark Knoll used to have a really wonderful piece that was on BioLogos, where he talked about the fact that with the expansion of the United States in the frontier, the institutions were sort of left in the colonies, and so you'd have these much more implicit traditions that would build trust between people. And institutions do that. You have credentialing and you have all this formality. Well, then people had to find new forms of trust. With fundamentalism, there was a sense of, this is sort of, they're recalcitrant, they're stubborn. Evangelicals are going to be people with fundamentalist commitment, but East Coast credentials and degrees. And Billy Graham, in many ways put the evangelical, they were technically neo-evangelicals. Molly Worthen's book on this, I think, is really excellent, really put them on the map. When this became, I think evangelical has become almost more of a political term than a religious term currently. And I think that's part of the reason you see people either shunning away from it. I've had people come into my church and tell me things like, I'm not really a Christian. I don't really know if I believe in the whole Christian God. They might be sort of new agey, and then they'll identify as an evangelical because they sort of identify as politically conservative or Republican. And
I saw stats on that like the people who identified as evangelicals but didn't go to church were the biggest group that supported Trump.
That's right. And I think that's become a big part of it, and I think a lot of that has been because, particularly you of course had the rise of the moral majority in the 80s, and then Karl Rove with George W. Bush's first election looked and said, if we can really appeal to the evangelicals, and you had George W. Bush with his Walk on the Beach, with Billy Graham, you had all of those pieces, it was political success.
Right.
And
so I think it's become a political term.
I was going to say it's really interesting to go back. I was just rereading Sam Harris's letter to a Christian nation, and you see that new atheist paranoia about Bush-era evangelicalism, that like Harris was thinking the evangelicals are coming. They're in charge of politics. They're pushing atheists to the fringe of the public square. You can't run for political office and be an atheist. They're going to outlaw abortion everywhere, yada, yada, yada. And now, Sam Harris is pretty quiet about that now. He's all bound up with...
He's trying to keep himself from getting canceled.
Also, where I was going with that is that now Harris will talk about wokeness. And so, I mean, that's where a lot of the energy of the new atheism has kind of shifted, because they sense that evangelicals aren't the kind of political threat anymore that they were worried about in the Bush era. So that, a lot of their hyper predictions didn't really come true. And so now they kind of view that battle as having been won. So they're like, yeah, we don't really care so much anymore. Now we're going to turn to focus on this new threat, which wokeness is the new religious threat, so to speak.
Yeah, in that Bush era, there were a number of books about this coming theocracy. I think Kevin Phillips wrote one, kind of like, theocrats are about to take over. Didn't Damon Linker write one? There's a number of these things. It's like a theocracy is coming thanks to George W. Bush, which in retrospect it looks kind of ludicrous. It's like these people went off the rails. So that should always be a warning to us when we start making apocalyptic proclamations that we're going to look stupid later. That's why I try to always say, try to avoid apocalyptic thinking, because it's, there's nothing newer than thinking the world's going to end constantly. But I do think it's interesting. I think that evangelicals have not quite figured out political kind of the engagement with politics or political theology. Evangelicals were originally Democrats. Jimmy Carter was the first evangelical president. Even to the early 80s, plurality evangelicals identified as Democrat, but they became Republicans, and they've been the most loyal Republican voting bloc. Even though, I worked briefly, I shouldn't say briefly, for 5 years for a major conservative think tank. And so I know a little bit about Conservatism Inc. And evangelicals have no power whatsoever in Conservatism Inc. Conservatism Inc., to the extent that it's Christian, has almost entirely been Catholic dominated since the Temple of F. Buckley. In essence, it was a conservatism of social outsiders. Very weird. There's a lot to be read there. In say 92, they were supported George H.W. Bush, who was not at all an evangelical. And even in 96, they supported Dole over Buchanan, even though Buchanan was much more of a serious man of faith, Catholic, but a man of faith than Dole. It seems like they give a lot of loyalty to the Republican Party and have gotten not much in return for it. So I think that's one. And I do think they got sideways with some of their principles, like, morality in leaders is a deal breaker. And so you say that about Bill Clinton, and then when you turn around and support Trump, it does, it does look bad, to be quite honest. I think it does show that, the principle you had articulated was really not a full articulation. Not that there's no concern about morality, but I think there's other considerations. Just like in World War II, we got allied with some bad guys, Stalin, to win this war. And so I feel like some things are bad there. The other thing I'll just throw out there is, I hear this all the time. It's a sin to vote for a Democrat because of abortion. That essentially abortion trumps all. But what you're really saying when you say that is, literally, someone can support anything as long as they're strong on abortion. It doesn't matter what else they do. They can support anything the left wants. But so you've kind of talked yourself into a box on it, So now here's someone who supports all this child gender transition. Is that really? So I feel like the rhetoric. They use this rhetoric, and it's used to kind of manipulate people, but it's not really even what people believe when they're faced with a different set of circumstances. What do you think needs to change in the political philosophy and political strategy of the conservative voter?
Well,
or the evangelical voter, or kind of the evangelical faith?
I do think it's really interesting now that it looks like Roe versus Wade is probably going to get overturned. I'll be really interested to see how that changes the political calculus going forward, particularly for the Republican presidential race. Because I think the tyranny of SCOTUS lies behind a lot of this. First Roe v. Wade and then Obergefell. So these watershed moments where the courts just began taking power in, I would argue, unconstitutional ways. So that created a kind of desperation in the voting base that, like, we have to somehow counteract this judicial tyranny, even if that means holding our noses and voting for Trump. So, I mean, to be fair, there were a lot of, I would say, reluctant Trump voters.
Right.
People who kind of sensed that, I know, I remember the Clinton era, I was really anti-Clinton, but I got to do this because of the babies, right? And so that Roe versus Wade is in the background here. So I knew a lot of really earnest people who were like, it's a lesser of two evils thing. This might be sort of our last Hail Mary pass to try and get some conservative justices on the court to try and overturn Roe versus Wade, which, I mean, it looks like it might be paying off now. Now, that doesn't mean, I mean, I didn't vote for Trump either time. I'm fine with that. I'm happy with that. I think that was the right thing to do. But I can understand why people who did vote for Trump feel like, see, we took a gamble and it paid off. It worked. We were vindicated. So I wonder if maybe now that Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned, I would like to see if perhaps that will shift people's priorities a little bit so that they're not as invested in the presidential race per se, because I think there's an unhealthy fixation on that where people should be thinking more locally, thinking more state level. So that might change things right there. That might kind of realign people's priorities, realign conservatives' focus so that they're not feeling like they have to do anything, you know.
Yeah, I don't. So I grew up, as I told with my story, mostly in African American communities. In my church, we have some, it's Sacramento is this capital of California. We've got staffers who work for mostly Democratic. If you're going to work in the California State House, you're probably going to be working for a Democrat.
Right.
It's the way California politics is. Many of those folks are African American, traditionally a very strong Democratic voting group. One of the things that people seldom realize is how conservative African American Christians generally are, even when they vote Democratic. So I've never really been sort of in this binary myself. I do remember in the 70s still you had pro-life Democrats, and part of what we've seen is the purification of both parties along certain lines. I don't know where this all goes. So today is election day in California, and I find Michael Schellenberger's candidacy, for governor, he's trying to get on the ballot against Gavin Newsom, running on a platform about, the homeless. One of my good friends is a staffer for someone on the city council of LA. And one of the things that you see even in California is that the Democrats can lose if they don't pay attention to issues that relate to daily life. And in California, a lot of that has been homelessness, drug addiction, and many of those issues. Generally speaking, people here have watched a lot of my rough drafts. You know how I handle politics in my sermon. I regularly use political illustrations, but I think most people listening to me would say he's a little difficult to pin down politically. In that sense, I, sort of in the Tim Keller school, because in many ways I do come out of that Westminster East strange amalgam of second wave anti-racism, urban ministry, and therefore not terribly politically dogmatic. Although I don't think politics is escapable, because, as I've said often, I think politics is now and religion is always. I think politics is cents and religion is dollars. These two things are deeply intertwined, as they have been throughout all of history, but to actually figure out their negotiation, I'm going to say something very radical. I think probably the best person to understand how to fight a culture war was Jesus Christ. Because I think any reading the Gospels demonstrates that Jesus is in the middle of a culture war where the Jews were fighting for their cultural survival, with Hellenism and the Roman way impinging upon them. And you had all of the menu options of resisting Rome. You had Pharisees, which were sort of culture warriors, work on the symbolism, Sabbath observance. Then you had people who were sort of assimilating to the Romans in terms of the aristocracy. You had the Zealots, who were the violent revolutionaries, and you had the Essenes, who had bunkers out in the desert. And Jesus manages to alienate all parties. And it gets him killed, but I think Jesus is the first stop for trying to figure out how to prosecute a culture war. And it's very nuanced.
Oh, it's this great line in Fiddler on the Roof where Yenta, the matchmaker, is talking to her friend Golda. She says, Golda, if God lived on earth, people would break his windows. And of course, she's a Jew saying that. It's a very profound comment, which goes exactly to what Paul is saying here. So yeah, maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but there's a lot of discourse over winsomeness. Should Christians be winsome? What posture should we have towards the world? And I think we need to recover sarcastic Jesus as a mood, as the kids say, because people will say we need to be Christ-like. Okay, that means we should be sarcastic some of the time, because Jesus alienated everybody, and he could be very unwinsome in that sense. So I think, I think being a culture warrior is to follow in Jesus' steps in some sense.
They used to call the Episcopal Church the Republican Party at prayer.
The Episcopal Church?
Yes. And well,
Yes.
back in the day when the republicanism was associated with Thurston Howell III and the uber rich, the Episcopal Church was kind of called that. But nevertheless, if you look at these mainline denominations or even Catholicism, you did see that people of very different politics would go to church together. And Anthony Bradley he's great on Twitter. I love Anthony Bradley on Twitter. He knows how to stir it up. He made this. He posted a picture of Eric Metaxas and George Stephanopoulos, and he said, 50 years ago, these guys would have been going to the same church, and like now, it's what's going on. So there was this sense in which they attended the same church. Some of these churches, like the Episcopal Church or the Catholic Church, because it's very liturgical. It's sacramental. You're going to. There's not a lot of theological content per se. Being preached from the pulpit. But also, these, in a sense, were somewhat social institutions, and they were kind of generic liberal Protestantism. It wasn't real. It was easy to give your assent to these things. Today, in a world where whether or not to require mass or meet in person are very kind of politically, if they're not political, they're polarized in the same lines as politics and every other issue in society. Is it realistic to think that you can have a church that has people of different kind of secular political persuasions kind of be in fellowship with one another in kind of a single local congregation? Is that, for the most part, is that something we should aspire to? Maybe like the idea of the multi-ethnic church. Is this something that we should aspire to as normative, or is this something that we have to realize we're going to have red church, blue church, establishment church, anti-establishment church? I'm curious as your takes on that.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know, did you follow, was it Pelosi who got excommunicated recently? I
did.
Yeah, okay. I think that's an interesting thing to discuss. And now, of course, with Protestant churches, you don't have the issue of, I guess eating and drinking to your damnation. Paul talks about that. So I think that is difficult because certain of these things, like where you fall on a particular issue, whether it's abortion or affirming homosexuality or that kind of thing, if these are made, table issues, so to speak, like as the priest or as the pastor, could conscience give you communion? That becomes sort of a litmus test as far as church membership goes, to where you can't really be a member in good standing until you've repented of your view on X, Y, or Z thing, which some people might say, well, X or Y are political issues, and then a conservative Protestant might say, no, they're not just political issues. These are, matters of orthodoxy in a sense. They might not be part of the Nicene Creed, but they're, anthropological matters of orthodoxy and heterodoxy. So I think, I don't think necessarily that is attainable if those are made table issues. I'm sure Paul has many thoughts there. So, yeah.
Well, my church is such a church. Like I said, we have Democratic staffers and people that I know voted for Trump, and they come in many different colors and ethnicities across both lines. There's a woman in our women's Bible study who came to Living Stones for a few months, almost 20 years ago. In a series of sermons, she expected me to preach certain lines that would be reliably preached in what she imagined were right-wing evangelical churches, and I did not make those statements, and she was angry with me, and she and her husband stopped coming to worship and found a church that would rehearse those lines for her. But for the last 20 years, she has been coming to the women's Bible study. And she is there and with mostly African-American women, most of whom will probably vote for the Democratic Party, not all of them. And they get their feathers ruffled and they go back and forth, but they are in the same room learning to live with each other. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite Jordan Peterson moments was when he was on Bill Maher and the panelists were sort of yucking it up about the ignoramuses that put Donald Trump in office, and Jordan Peterson stops and says, they're half your country. What are you gonna do?
Right.
We don't hopefully divorce our spouses when they vote for the wrong candidate. Kick people out of our church when we vote for the wrong candidate. I'd rather have us sit down and have a conversation and learn how to talk about it.
Right.
Well, and I mean, I'm not saying kick people out without having a conversation either. So, I mean,
first we'll have a conversation, then we'll kick you out.
Maybe. I mean, it kind of depends. But I mean, I think of these things as discipleship issues in a way. I mean, I think it's part of bringing somebody along to help them have a coherent worldview, kind of a holistic worldview. So I'm not going to say if you vote for a Democrat you're going to hell, but I mean I think there's things to be worked through in conversation. So yeah, I'll slightly moderate what I said there.
Okay, so we're shortly going to have a Q&A session, and for those of you watching live, we're actually going to turn this limited mic battery capacity here. We're coming up on the end of that. And so I'm going to have one more question for you guys, and then we're going to end the stream, and then we're going to do a little Q&A. So thanks, everyone, for joining. And the question is this. At some level, all of us here could be labeled influencers. And we see that Jordan Peterson is an influence. This idea that people are turning away from the institutions and the traditional authorities towards affinity groups, towards influencers, towards people that they find on the internet. Given that it's somewhat almost unavoidable to operate as an influencer today, what would your suggestion be for us as influencers about what we should be doing and how we should be behaving in order to contribute to moving the country or the church in the right direction? What are maybe any do's and don'ts you have for influencers? And I ask this for purely selfish reasons. I'm interested in getting any tips. And maybe you actually have more perspective because you have a foot in the influencer world and a foot in the institution world.
I think loving your enemies is basic Christianity, not advanced level. And as I said earlier this morning, I'm in the Midwest because we're going to a synod of the Christian Reformed Church where we will be talking about same-sex marriage. We have a human sexuality report. It's a very hot thing, and I try to remind people that whatever the issue that you are talking about, people will remember how they are treated more than they will remember what the positions were. because the positions change rapidly. They really do. But they will remember how they are treated. And that goes back to the elites. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a WASP by any measure. And a large number of Americans, my grandfather hated him, but large numbers of Americans loved him because they felt he treated them with respect. And I think if we are going to actually make progress influencing, that is how you will finally influence. If you love them and they understand it, you will influence.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I would say read a lot. So I've written a fair bit around gay issues in the church, gay rights history, all that stuff. But I've read a lot of gay literature in the course of that. So when I go to write about it, I'm hopefully going places that other people haven't already gone. So try and find something new to say, for sure. As an influencer, don't just follow a sort of cookie cutter model. You know, even good cookie cutter models. I mean, there's lots of stuff that people could say that I might agree with, but I always want to sort of go where there is no path and leave a trail. Don't just react. That's something, Aaron, that you've been discussing, that we've been discussing. Check yourself, see if you're falling into a rut of just always reacting to the latest things. So for myself, I always try to keep a balance. I always want to make sure I'm keeping my Substack up with just brand new stuff, just creative stuff that's not even part of the discourse necessarily. Just evergreen things. Find good, true, beautiful things that nourish your own soul, that just bring you joy. Because if it brings you joy and you're good at enthusiastically talking about it, then it will hopefully bring other people joy as well, and it'll just enrich you as a human being. Another thing I would say is respond to people. Like if people try and write to let you know that they like what you're doing, just answer them. Like write a nice email back, write a nice DM back, because it doesn't matter if they're high status people or low status or like whatever. They're readers. They're the reason that you're out there being an influencer. You couldn't be an influencer without your audience. So love your audience well. Love the people who brung you, and they will love you back.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for that. Again, I appreciate you all tuning in for this experimental live stream, and again, in front of the audience. And thank you all for coming. And again, Paul Vanderklay, Bethel McGrew, and you can find links to their material in the show notes. So thank you all very much. And I guess you can shut the stream down.